Hello, everyone. My name is Rosanna Lamanna. I'm a partner here at Fuller Landau, an accounting, tax, and advisory firm. I co-lead our food and beverage group at the firm. With me today is Chris Conway, CEO of Food and Beverage Ontario. Food and Beverage Ontario represents and advocates for members of the food processing industry, which is the #1 manufacturing sector employer in Ontario. So Chris and I will be discussing the major issues and opportunities facing Ontario food processors in 2022 and beyond. So welcome, Chris, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. I appreciate it.
So Chris, many industries have faced numerous challenges caused by the pandemic. We've heard of supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, just to name a few. And then I think even Mother Nature hasn't really been on our side either with some of these extreme weather conditions. If you were to, maybe briefly summarize some of those key issues facing food processors in Ontario now and possibly in the future, what would they be?
Well, I think, Rosanna, probably the biggest issue right now is we have a system under strain. And so anything that occurs is going to cause further disruption. So I think that's what we're seeing a lot of right now. We've had, flooding in BC. We've had the Ambassador Bridge situation. We've had, other protests, notably in Ottawa as well, going on, and then of course we have the backdrop of COVID at any given time, which is also having an impact on the workforce. So, ultimately, labor is the #1 issue for us, and all these things are ultimately impacting a few things: labor and the supply chain, right? So that's where we're starting to see issues, and that is affecting, as you mentioned, it's affecting price point, on things. Cost of goods are increasing and so on because of what's happening with the system. And we've seen a number of these things in recent months that have, and I think we've held up remarkably well as an industry in spite of this, but certainly behind the scenes, people are working very, very hard to make sure that food stays on the shelves in the supermarkets.
For sure. No, thanks, Chris, for that. I know we often hear of these sort of labor shortages, and I actually think they've been brewing for some time now. I think there was a lot of companies that were already finding it challenging to attract talent, especially to the manufacturing floor. But perhaps I think maybe the past couple of years have maybe amplified some of the issues, around that, and with COVID and some of the absenteeism in the workplace has been more challenging. And then there's the temporary foreign worker program, which, allows for the migration of people into Canada to help fill employment gaps. It too has seen its sort of fair share of challenges. And I think all of these combined have had a pretty significant impact on the industry. Excuse me. But Chris, maybe you could tell us what you're kind of seeing and hearing when it comes to labor shortages within the industries, and maybe what steps some of the employers are taking to mitigate them.
Sure. As I mentioned, labor, as our board chair likes to joke, top 3 issues for us, labor is definitely the top challenge for the industry. And it's due to a few things. I think there's an awareness issue about the opportunities potentially, but also we've had some stuff related to COVID. Like I mentioned, Omicron, for example. Well, we had, people, the requirement was to sit out for 5 days, for example. If you're vaccinated, you have a positive test, and there was guidance around this. So people were out as a result of this, right? So you have someone has a positive test, they're out for a period of time. And that's varied, right, throughout the course of the pandemic, how long people sit out with these things. And our sector generally has been very, very compliant with that. Like I can tell you, we have weekly discussions with our board, and people are really, really trying hard to stay on top of this stuff. So that's had an impact at any given time. You've got a certain number of people who are going to be out due to that. And then you've got issues with, sort of recruitment, retention, people leaving. We've all seen the articles referring to the Great Resignation, things like that. So there are changes that are happening in the workforce across the board at any rate, and we're being affected by that as well. We really do think awareness is an issue. They're good jobs. It's a great industry to work in. The pay is good, and people can come in and get on the job training. So, we've got a lot of programs running internally. We've got about a dozen initiatives actually going to promote the sector, labor training. All kinds of different things. I won't go into a lot of detail around them, but suffice to say, we're working really hard on addressing that issue as an industry.
For sure. And I think that's probably well needed, especially at this time, just the access. And I know you've got that program Career Now that has been launched and is growing. I think that's a great, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of the employer-employee matching
Yes, so we've actually got an employer-employee portal, as you mentioned, that accesses, I wasn't even aware this existed, but there's a student database that we are partnered with a group that is partnered with Ryerson indirectly, so Magnet and Ryerson, and it's able to access every student in the post-secondary database across the country. So if, let's say you're in BC and you're looking for a job in food and beverage, you can access this and it'll provide you with opportunities in the industry. So it's an amazing tool. We've got virtual job fairs going on. We've got mentorship stuff. All the stuff's had to take place virtually, of course. Normally, we'd be doing these things on site, but there are language training programs, mentorship, as I mentioned, skills training. There's just all kinds of stuff happening with this. We're now starting to partner with First Nations. I just was answering an email. We're going to be doing a disabilities initiative. As well. So that's something we're now getting involved with for people with disabilities to get into the food and beverage processing space. So there's all kinds of stuff happening with this at any given time. We're doing work on the national level as well. Our national chapter is very focused on the temporary foreign worker issue. We're also part of a national labor initiative that's run by the Canadian Agri-Food Human Resources Council. And so we're part of that. And then other ongoing discussions related to this. We also have a project running through the Ministry of Agriculture. We're doing regional workforce pilots. Additionally, we've got some of them running through careers now. So identifying what the challenges are in different regions, what's working, what's not working. So this is really comprehensive, Rosanna. I think we really are, if you look at the studies that are out there, we've taken all the pieces that have been identified in that research and we're trying to implement it. So it's really rubber hits the road stuff to address these issues.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of food processors could probably take advantage of some of these programs, and some of them may not have been aware of them. So check out the website. That's a free plug for you, Chris.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about, some of the labor shortages, because I know just from conversations I've been having with my clients, it seems that, some of the ways to address it has also been through automation. And so we're seeing a lot of, food manufacturing companies, they're investing in automation. It's really just a means to manage some of the labor shortages. And obviously, a way to improve overall efficiencies within their plants as well, from a longer term perspective. But I do see companies investing in some robotics, the training programs that are there to help support them. But it is an expensive undertaking. And I know that there are, programs available to help them. I know you've named some of them from there. It always, being, a partner in an accounting firm, I have to talk a little bit about the SHRED program that's just been around for such a long time. But it just always amazes me how there's a number of companies out there that don't even put forward a claim for whatever reason that is. But, if companies are willing to invest the time and put together a claim, there are some pretty significant tax credits that are available to some of these business owners, in addition to some of the other government funded programs that are available to help support, capital expenditures that they have. So I don't know, what are you sort of seeing and hearing from sort of the automation investment front?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting point, Rosanna. Something we focus on a lot is smaller, medium-sized companies. To your point about awareness of some of the programs that are out there and people taking advantage of them, that's something we worry about when, particularly right now during COVID, a lot's happening. People are very focused on maintaining their operations and they may miss things that are out there. And, particularly if you got a smaller organization, you don't have necessarily the staff resources. Even larger companies sometimes, people say, well, for example, some members will say they think we have all these resources to dedicate to these things, and it might be one person on staff who really is trying to track this. So even in a larger context, we hear things like that. So that sort of thing's really, really important for us to maintain and to manage from an association perspective. But we're certainly really encouraged with the announcement last fall, the $25 million Strategic Agri-Food Processing Fund, which is really designed to address some of the things you're talking about with respect to automation and capital improvements. That's a really good starting point for us. It's something that we think there should be more investment in the industry for this. And we've highlighted it pretty consistently that we think it's, and something else I would add about that is by the time a job becomes available for automation, it's probably been sitting vacant for 2 years. Like a process is automated. We hear that role has sat vacant for a period of time. And this can also help retention in some cases. Like we have an example in an automation study we did that robotic palletization can actually reduce turnover in some cases because people aren't doing this heavy lifting. So there are all kinds of benefits to that. We're manufacturing like many other industries. People often forget that. And so those type of investments are equally important for us as they are for other industries in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, for sure. And just sort of listening to you speak there, one other point that came to mind just on the awareness of programs and just, I'm going to say, do some homework, do some research. I do know some of these programs, when you apply for them, there's going to be certain information you're going to need to provide them, in terms of financial information or even post-reporting information. But more importantly, what I've seen is sometimes that people apply for them, but they've already expended some of the money on the automation or the program and the eligibility, and because of the date that their application is actually approved, some of those, I'm going to say, expenses prior to approval may not be eligible just based on dates. So if you are planning a big project, it's really important that you look for what sort of government funding or grants are available to you in advance, apply for them before you actually embark on them, and make them part of your business strategy so that you can maybe take advantage of some of these programs, and then just be prepared, for any sort of post-reporting requirements.
And I would just add that goes to the importance of seeking expertise, right, when you do these things. And so I think, for smaller organizations, that's something in particular they really have to do, is you have to seek out and get that advice before you embark on this, because you may not know, you may not be familiar with the process. Somebody else is very familiar with this, it does this all the time. You embark on it, it's new. And like you said, they can potentially make mistakes in the process and start on something before they do the application, and then inadvertently become ineligible. So.
Right, absolutely. So I wanted to just circle back on one of the points you made earlier in the conversation, just around commodity prices and food increases. I know I was actually just recently reading an article where it talked about food inflation sort of hit 6.5%, which was higher than the overall annual inflation rate of about 5%. So that's pretty significant impact on the food business or the food industry in general. So I don't know, what are you sort of hearing and seeing around sort of food processors and what they're doing in terms of dealing with these rising food prices or even inputs from a manufacturing perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been some attention to that, and we're all seeing it at the supermarket when we go there. So you definitely notice it there, but there are many factors going into it. I think some of the question is how much retailers are going to allow these costs to be passed on in the short term. In the longer term, I think everybody has to. And we just saw there was a media article the other day about a food processing company that was in a dispute with a major retailer about that. And so we are going to start seeing more of these things, and about costs and how they're going to be passed on. And ultimately the consumer pays as what happens with these things. So that's unfortunate. And it's going to have an impact on people, particularly people who don't have the money. In some cases, they're already kind of short on things, and budgets are tight. It's going to be challenging for them. But we're certainly hearing across the board, the supply chain, there's an impact for that on cost. People are having difficulty sourcing things. When they do, it's much more expensive. Shipping is much more expensive. So at the end of the day, that does ultimately show up somewhere. And so the consequence of keeping your operations flowing is you're trying, like people are saying, wherever they can get the supplies that they need, they're trying to get them. But then the cost is the trade-off with that. You may be paying much more. I've heard things, for example, with trucking. I heard something last week. Somebody was paying 4 to 5 times the price they were paying a little while ago to get a pallet on a truck. And this is all anecdotal. I mean, but certainly when you see that, when you hear that kind of thing, that's going to show up at the end of the day for the price of food. So,
right. And it just seems like everything seems to have a domino impact on each other, right? Like even sort of, we talked about the labor shortage, but even in the labor shortage, not just in the manufacturing plant, but even in the trucking industry, and trying to find people who are going to be driving these trucks is sometimes a challenge in of itself. And so it's very hard to sort of move the product across borders as a result.
It's a very good point. There was an article written a while ago. It was written by someone who'd been a truck driver for 20 years talking about these issues. And one of the comments was these delays mean that a lot of the drivers are earning less than minimum wage effectively, because they're showing up to get a container, they're waiting for hours to deliver, there are delays on the way, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people are getting out of the business, so to speak, or they're not drawn to it, or it's very difficult for them to make a living. So that's definitely a big factor as well. There are real issues around other parts of the industry as well, and trucking is definitely one of them.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to sort of touch base a little bit on sort of some of the weather impact, because I know working with sort of clients in the food space where they rely on sort of crops that are produced in other parts of the world. I know I'm going to maybe just talk a little bit about sort of the coffee industry, because I think most of us likely enjoy a cup or two of coffee in the morning. And most of our coffee, oh, there you go. And Chris got one in hand. So very timely. But most of our coffee beans, come from places like Brazil and Colombia. And I know like climate change has been having a huge impact on, places like Brazil, where they've had some, severe droughts. They've had frost, and, it's really destroyed a lot of the crops. And it takes some time for those coffee bean crops to grow again if you lost all your crops and had to start from scratch. And so, when you think of just the impact on the crops and the production and, sort of the supply demand equation and all that. And then you also think about, beyond the coffee bean itself and, the costs that hit everything else that goes into making that cup of coffee, either packaging materials, labor costs, energy, used to either produce it or even to transport it. All these sort of things with all the prices going up is obviously a big impact on, pricing, commodity prices, which in turn hits the processors, and then the processors are faced with that decision as to, who absorbs that sort of thing, right? So
it's a very good point, Rosanna. We often say that we're joined at the hip with primary agriculture in many cases, right? And when we see things happen, that we will, in a certain situations, we'll immediately look at something and say, okay, how does this affect processing? And within 24 to 48 hours, it's affected somewhere else in the supply chain, and we start hearing about it. To your point, I think we've all had the experience recently. You go into a supermarket and you'll notice, like the fruit that you're buying bananas are already ripe, and it's delays like this. Things are showing up this way. But yeah, there's definitely an impact on our membership. We have obviously, like for example, we have fruit and vegetable processors in our membership. We have parts of the industry that are very susceptible to the supply chain, things being fresh. Then you have livestock as well, and there's grain. And when you talked about flooding, for example, like out west, I mean, some of the things that I was hearing when that happened, I mean, a lot of livestock died as a result of that, right? It's something we don't think about. Poultry, for example, is very vulnerable to flooding because they're at ground level. So, we started hearing stories about this, and then the question is, what's the full impact, and so on and so forth. And so the system is definitely delicate. And when certain types of things happen, it really shows up quickly. So to your point about primary agriculture, absolutely, we're linked at the hip, as we like to say, with them. And you certainly find that out very quickly when something happens.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that was definitely it hit hard to many companies right across the country. It wasn't sort of limited to sort of the BC area. So definitely some impact, which just kind of goes to show sort of the whole logistics, transportation issues, the supply chain in general, some of the stress that it's been under, and maybe ways to, I think people or companies are potentially looking at different ways that they can sort of manage their own inventory levels, their sourcing and where they buy from. I know some have shifted to, where can I buy this local? Others have looked at, and I guess I'm also thinking about even the restaurant industry. I've heard of some of them where they've had to, revise their menus because they couldn't get all the ingredients they needed to make a particular dish. So I think a lot of people are sort of looking to see what are some of the alternatives for them to help them sort of continue on.
Absolutely. I mean, we conducted a survey last fall, and over 50% of our members have reduced products or processes as a result of the labor shortage, right? So that's right off the bat. So to your point about, finding certain products, people have reduced what they're producing, right? So there's still, like, you're going to go in a supermarket and you're going to find chicken. But as I've had said to me recently, it may not be a boneless, skinless chicken breast, because the labor that's involved, we never think about this when we buy these things, right? So, so that is definitely one of the impacts that's out there for sure. So
Chris, I want to switch gears a little bit. I think, thinking a little bit about cybersecurity. When we think of cyber attacks, I think most of us probably think about the impacts they've had on government or on some of the technology companies. However, they actually do extend to the food and beverage industry as well. Unfortunately, they're not immune from it. And we heard of, a meat processing company that had, that was held ransom after being a target of a cyber attack. And not only does it result in sort of financial loss or business interruption, but I think one of the concerns too in the food industry that's very real is somebody could hack a system and potentially change an ingredient that goes into the production of a product. And that can have greater sort of health issues or risks to the end consumer if that were to happen. So sort of thinking beyond just your typical, business interruption and financial loss, those are just some examples of what could actually go wrong with a cyber attack when it comes to food, health, and safety risks. So I know we had some discussions around this. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about.
Sure, we've been very fortunate not to have had any safety issues, and I think part of the reason is that the type of attacks people are getting, in some ways, when this happens, it's in some ways it's sophisticated that they know exactly who to go after. And now with increasing automation and things like that, much more of somebody's operations are potentially vulnerable to cyber attack, ransomware, and so on and so forth. We have been very fortunate that food safety hasn't been compromised at all. And part of the reason I think is, and we hear things about this. So for example, something I've learned, about, fairly recently about this is apparently if you pay ransom, your systems don't just come back to normal. They are very focused on shutting down your systems. They're not focused on you getting things back. So in the same way, they're not necessarily very careful where the damage is occurring. But it is getting into all kinds of things when this happens. So it's something we're really aware of as an industry now. And I think we traditionally haven't been sort of a target of this. You hear a lot more about it in financial services or things like that, but it's out there, and we're subject to this as well. And I would say to people that get good advice on it, prepare your systems. There are things you can do to mitigate this that we've heard. We've got resources posted on our website as well about cybersecurity that we've developed in response to things that we're hearing in the market. So yeah, but it's a complex area, and things you hear about. Just for example, I do this, I think a lot of us do, don't necessarily turn off and restart my laptop a lot. I tend to just, put it in sleep mode or something like that. You don't update your security software when you do that. So that apparently can be a vulnerability. Older desktops that are left in offices that don't have the security upgrades on them, things like that. So there's all kinds of stuff we've heard, phishing emails, being very cautious about things like that. Those are some basic things you can do, but once something happens, you really do have to get on it immediately and start getting advice about, what parts of your system you can make to be critical, that are critical, you can manage, you can sort of save in a situation like that. You can get advice from IT companies and others on how to do that stuff. And I think it's worth exploring for a lot of groups because this is happening now.
For sure. And it sounds like there's some small wins that we can, I'm going to say little things that we can do immediately that could hopefully help from a security perspective as well. In addition to obviously, doing vulnerability assessments and other things to mitigate risks around systems or even revisiting. I know some manufacturers have had the same operating system for a number of years and just haven't had a need to change or upgrade, but that in itself could potentially introduce some vulnerabilities as well. So lots to think of.
Yeah, and I would just say, one of the things I mentioned about cloud, they say, for example, if you're putting, you can put some of your critical systems in the cloud, and that's obviously some of those systems like, Microsoft, things like that, they're running at a very, very high level in terms of security and they're updated regularly, and you can move certain things in there. So if something does happen, at least you have a core group of things that will be safe if you've prepared for it and provided that doesn't get affected as well. But yeah, there are many dimensions to this sort of thing, and it's a whole other world, I like to say, that's out there.
For sure. So Chris, just before we end things off, if we were to leave the audience with one piece of advice, what would it be?
In terms of cybersecurity or
anything we've talked about today?
I would say just generally, we shouldn't take for granted that there is food on the shelves in the supermarkets, and I would say that there's an industry that's working very hard to ensure that happens. And just think of that, be aware of it, remember that when you go in. I think we always talk about this internally. It's a success of the industry on one hand that things are very reliable, but behind the scenes there are a lot of people working very, very hard. We're the largest manufacturing industry by employment in Ontario and in Canada. So there are a lot of people working hard to make sure that happens.
For sure. No, thank you for that, Chris. I think those are definitely words of wisdom. I think we do take for granted sort of all the things that happen behind the scenes, when you think of sort of the farm to fork process. So, well, there's certainly a lot going on in this industry, lots of opportunities, support for growth. Chris, I want to say thank you very much for your time today. Your perspective, your insights, tremendously helpful. For anyone in the food processing industry in Ontario and for all Ontarians, we're all impacted by this vital sector. So thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. Really appreciate it.